Hey YouTube, welcome to another episode of Unproductive, the productivity series for the rest of us. I know it's been a while since I recorded something in this series, and this is actually going to be a little bit different from what we normally do in Unproductive. So just for some framing and context, I'm going to try to post this, I think, in January when people are really thinking about New Year's resolutions and getting on top of their finances for the year. But I'm recording it in early December, and I am right in the thick of this topic. So I am thinking about finances and budget and what I'm going to be doing for 2020. And what makes this a little bit different? So one, it is about finances, which I think fits into productivity, but it might be a little tangential. But the real thing is that in this series, I really try to focus on how everyone is different and trying to think of like ways to talk about productivity that are customizable, that honor everybody's different life circumstances, etc. So this video still comes from that place of wanting to provide advice that you might not be able to get, that might not be your like standard advice, in this case on financial matters, but this is for a pretty specific audience. So I want to describe that first so you can decide whether this is relevant to you. Because I know that money stuff is it's so frustrating when somebody with a lot of financial privilege is like, hey, you could just use your Starbucks money or whatever bullshit they used to say to millennials around the recession. I'm not going to do that. So I'm going to be really clear, first of all, where I'm coming from. So I'm super financially privileged. I make more than enough money to be able to pay for my needs and also to be able to pay for a good amount of wants, to be able to support my family, to do different things. I'm not like super rich or anything. I still work for a nonprofit organization, but I do make more than enough money. And so to be clear, this is really not advice for folks who are living more paycheck to paycheck. There's great budget advice out there for you, but also you are living with that difficulty and that I've been there, like that systemic problem of not having enough supports, especially if you live in the United States and some other countries, not having the supports to be able to provide for what you need. So that is like a experience that I honor and I have empathy for, and it's not where I am right now, and so this advice is going to be less relevant to you. I think the audience that this really is for is folks who do have, whether it's a little or a lot extra, but find yourself like, if you tend to kind of ignore your finances or just kind of like let things happen, like not really want to look at your statements, if you kind of feel vaguely guilty sometimes about your spending, but you don't really know exactly what you want to do with it, if you've tried budgeting rigorously and found that it just doesn't work for you, that it always falls off, then this is for you. So folks who do have like some amount extra beyond what you need to take care of your needs, and are trying to like figure out how to save, but also you don't want to, and this is where I think the ethos of the series comes in, like you don't want to feel unnecessary guilt about it. There's all this kind of stuff around like shopping, especially, that can be really sexist, that can be really classist, and so how do we like get past that but also be kind of try to be accountable to what we want to do with our money? Because really, when it comes down to it, finances are all about your particular goals and your situation, and it's different for everybody. Okay, so here are the things I'm thinking as I'm going through my current setup. And just so you know, I use Mint. This is in no way sponsored by Mint, but that's the service I use. I know there's other ones that you can use like that. But I find that using something that you can automate to some extent is helpful, although I struggle with this. I'm going to really try in 2020 to like monthly check in on it. Because I have alerts set up so that if anything goes wrong or if there's like really high spending, I get a flag on it, but I don't necessarily look at the smaller purchases from day to day. So like it's not set it and forget it. I think it's still important. I'm going to talk about that in a minute, to look into things regularly, but also not having to like transfer everything manually can be really helpful. So the way I have it set up is like I recommend starting with your investment goals. So retirement, any big purchases, if you're planning to get a house, if you're planning to get a car, depending on your relative like income to expenditures, you might consider a big trip in this. I consider travel more with my regular spending, but if travel is more rare for you and something that is a really special occasion, you might have a specific travel budget. I did that for a big trip to Europe with my dad a few years ago. In Mint, you can do this where you can actually set up a goal and designate an account for it. So it's not always the best if you have a lot of goals, because you're probably not going to have like 6 accounts, one for each goal. But if you do, for example, have retirement accounts, you can tell Mint, these are my retirement accounts, they go to that goal. And it will help you, and there are many other tools that will help you like figure out about how much you should be saving for retirement. This is not a retirement video, so you would figure that out. But once you have a sense of how much you want to be saving towards specific goals, go ahead and consider that separate and think about that first. And then you're looking at the rest of your money. So I think that a lot of people give the advice, and this may be useful for some people, but a lot of people have like savings goals, right? So even beyond those big purchases, might have a goal. I want to save X amount of money per month. I want to not spend X amount of money per month. Personally, I find the reverse a little bit easier. So giving myself spending goals rather than giving myself savings goals. And I think this is because like random crap is going to come up. Like you're going to have medical needs that you didn't know. You're going to, your shoes are going to break and you need new shoes. Like there's going to be things that you do need to handle. You might have to help out, family members. I have very unpredictable times when I need to help a member of my family out, and I want to do that, every time if I can. And but I don't know when that would come up. So it's harder. Like for me, having a particular savings goal, the goal might be crashed through by something like that. And the spending goal would be too if your goal was like, I'm going to spend this much total. But the other piece of this is that I don't actually, and this is like gasp shock, probably not what most people would say, probably not considered good advice, but I've decided to not budget for every single category. So not try to guess like when those things are going to come in, not try to have an overall spending number for all spending that would include things like emergencies, because then I feel like I'm just going to feel guilty. Like if something comes up, what if a large percentage of my overall spending is to help out a parent? Then am I going to feel guilty that I did shopping as well? No, I would rather, my preference would be to just consider that year I'm going to spend a little more and I'm going to save a little less, and that's okay. Again, this is coming from a place of privilege and being able to do that, but I find that works better for me. So what I'm trying, I had all these budgets that I was honestly ignoring. Like I would budget for a lot of, like every different category, and I would mostly check in at, like occasionally on 1 or 2 categories I cared about. So given that, I thought, okay, why am I doing every category then? Why don't I just have budgets for the things I care about? So my recommendation here, so you have some things, for example, that are like inevitable, fairly predictable, and honestly I find more annoying to try to track down the variations than to just kind of let it happen. So things like utilities, rent, your actual paycheck, I took those budgets out, which I realized if you take your income out, it means you're not comparing income. But because I'm not looking at the full income and the full expenses, for me, I was like, I'm not going to budget that. I'm going to not budget for things like rent and utilities, for things, also for like categories that might be a little less predictable, but are more needs than wants. So for example, I know I'm going to have to sometimes buy new clothing or household items. I don't know exactly how much, so I'm not going to have a budget for clothes. Now, this is going to vary a lot person to person. Obviously, for some people, shopping for clothes is something where you do it, because it's fun for you and it's not a need. And so you might want to consider clothing a budget that you actually should track. This is going to be very personal, based on your shopping habits. So things that you don't feel like it's a challenge for you not to buy a lot of, whatever those categories might be. So for some that might be food. Food might just be a predictable thing. For me, actually, I've been spending way more than I want to on things like dining out. So I've decided to actually make food a category I track, even though it is a need, because I tend to spend grossly over what I would actually need to, and I want to work on that. If it's not, an area you need to work on, then if you're pretty predictable, you tend to spend about the same amount, then don't even worry about it. I also don't like to budget for things like I said, like helping family, just because, or even like charity or gifts, because, if I decide to give a little extra, I don't want to feel like, oh, I missed a goal. So what I am setting up a budget for, and what I would recommend considering budgeting for, if you're doing it this way, is particular spending categories that you might want to do or might find fun, kind of fun spending, but want a sense of how you're doing on. So for me, travel is one of these categories where I want to do it, I feel good about doing it, but I'm going to want to have a sense throughout the year of oh, how much have I spent on travel so far? I'm going to want to just there might be an opportunity that comes up, and I'd like to know, there's a tarot course that comes up. How much have I been spending on tarot courses this year? I just want to take a quick look. As well as categories that you tend to go overboard on, and you want to be aware of that, and that if you don't look at it, you're just going to randomly buy things a lot. For me, that's shopping, that's tarot decks especially. That's like I said, food and dining is a category like that for me. So for those specific categories, a fairly small list, setting up a budget. I like in Mint and other programs doing, if there's a rollover style. So you can actually set up in Mint, you can say, I expect to spend X amount every 3 months. But I always get confused by how that's displayed, and I don't get a sense of where I am for the year. So I actually like, even if I'm not intending to spend monthly, to just put in a monthly amount and then to use the rollover option, so that if I don't spend it, it goes forward, and if I spend more, then the next month is less. So it gives me a rolling, an accrual type thing, where I can see, I kind of accrue a certain amount of budget each month, and I can see where I am overall that way. So I like doing that. Of course, the challenge of this is you actually have to look at it. So we'll see how this goes for me. But my plan is, now that I have a smaller number of categories, to make sure that at least monthly I'm just looking at it overall to see where I am, noticing things like, oh, I'm a little over, I'm really having trouble sticking to this budget, what can I do about that? And also when I'm making a specific purchase. So when deciding whether to, get a tarot deck, or thinking about whether to travel, being able to look there and see, how am I doing? So if you don't look at it, it doesn't really work. The other thing I do that you may find helpful is I have an overall, what I call a slush budget, a total amount in mind, not for all categories, but for the categories that I consider kind of discretionary, like shopping, travel, not things like clothes, not food actually, so food is not in here. I'm going to look at it, I'm going to track it, but not including food in the slush amount. I have a sense of how much I want to spend on discretionary stuff for the entire year. And basically it takes the specific categories, like shopping categories, travel, and then it goes a little bit over that, but not much. And knowing that number, and keeping an eye on it, and which I can do each month, I can just look and see what I've spent that I've tagged as slush, also helps me get an overall idea of how I'm doing for the year. And it allows for two things. One is because I don't tag things as slush if they are needs, even if they might fall into one of the categories I've specifically budgeted for. It gives me a better sense. So a good example is, I do have a shopping amount that is, in my mind, it's part of that slush amount. But because, at least in Mint, you can't do budgets for a tag, you can only do them for a category. If I end up spending a lot on clothing, which is part of shopping. I might go over that budget, that specific budget, but when I look at the slush for the gear, I can see that I'm actually not over. So if that makes sense, like, I have those two things that I can balance between. So then there are unforeseen things that might happen that I couldn't even predict that technically go into a category, like shopping, like travel. Like I might decide, for example, if let's say there's an emergency in the family and I travel for that, I might decide not to tag that slush because that's sort of necessary travel in a way. And so I would know, it looks like I'm over on the travel budget, but checking the slush is a reminder to me that I'm not actually over like what I wanted to be spending discretionarily, that it's an emergency spending. You could also do that, by the way, by having a separate category that is not travel, or in my case of shopping and clothing. Like I could set it up so that those things never overlap. For me, I like to see both, so I just do the overlap, and it works for me. But the other thing that doing that slush thing helps for is if I go over in one category but underspend in another, then I feel fine. So let's say I am really over on shopping. I could check to see how I'm doing on slush and be like, oh, well, I've just traveled less this year, so I'm going to decide to continue to travel less. And I also can think of that when I'm looking at the monthly things. If I notice that one is super red and like, oh God, over, then I might say, okay, even though this one is green, I'm going to consider those to balance each other out. Of course, none of this is professional advice in any way. I have no actual background in this at all, except for experience. So, I'm sharing what works for me, which is what I always do in this series. You can take it or leave it. I would love to hear comments below on what do you think about budgeting? Are these tips useful for you? Do you have other tips for folks who might be reading the comments? And we'll see how it goes. Maybe I'll do an update later in the year. But if you enjoy this series, don't forget to subscribe. I will continue updating it, and have a great day.